The red laser dot was small, no larger than a coin, but it burned like a brand against the wet, torn white cotton of Quan Teo's shirt. It hovered right over his heart, a silent countdown in the pouring rain. Amani didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds or scream for help. In that fraction of a second, the terrified maid who had scrubbed floors and kept her head down vanished. She threw herself at him. Her small body slammed into his massive back, her arms stretching out in a desperate, futile attempt to cover his vital organs with her own flesh. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the impact, waiting for the burn of a bullet meant for the monster she had learned to love. Crack. The sound of the rifle shot tore through the humid night air, deafening and sharp. Amani flinched, a sob catching in her throat as she waited for the pain. She felt Teo's giant frame stiffen beneath her, his muscles locking up like granite, but he didn't fall. There was no spray of blood, no grunt of agony from the man she was clinging to. Instead, a heavy thud echoed from the rooftop across the alleyway. Slowly, Amani peeled one eye open. The red dot was gone. On the adjacent roof, a silhouette collapsed, a rifle clattering uselessly against the concrete. From the shadows of a water tower higher up, another figure stepped into the dim neon light, lowering a smoking long-range rifle. The figure raised a hand to an earpiece. Threat neutralized, a familiar, gruff voice crackled over the radio clip to Teo's belt. Target down. You didn't really think we'd let you walk into a trap alone, did you, sir? Teo let out a breath that sounded like a growl, his hand coming up to cover Amani's shaking hands that were still clutching his shredded shirt. He turned slowly, peeling her off his back but keeping her firmly within his grip, as if the wind might blow her away. He looked up at the roof where his head of security, Kong, was packing up his gear. I gave a stand-down order, Kong, Teo roared, though his voice lacked its usual bite. It was thick with relief. And with all due respect, sir, Kong called back, his voice faint over the distance. The men voted to ignore it. We protect the asset. Both of them. Teo looked down at Amani. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, not just the woman who cleaned his penthouse, but the woman who had just tried to use her body as a human shield for a man 3 times her size. His eyes, usually cold and dead, were wide with a mixture of horror and awe. You, he rumbled, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He grabbed her shoulders, his large fingers digging into her skin, not to hurt, but to make sure she was real. You foolish, little thing. What were you doing? You could have been killed. I couldn't let them take you, Amani whispered, her teeth chattering from the shock and the cold rain soaking through her clothes. I couldn't watch you die. Teo closed his eyes for a moment, resting his forehead against hers. The rain plastered his dark hair to his skull, water dripping down the jagged scar that marred his cheek. For a moment, the monster of soul looked human. He looked terrified. But then, his eyes snapped open, and his gaze drifted down to her body. His brow furrowed, the tenderness instantly replaced by a flash of confused rage. His hand moved from her shoulder to the silk fabric clinging to her waist. It was a stunning, emerald green evening gown, backless, elegant, and completely wrong. This dress, he growled, his thumb rubbing harsh against the expensive silk. You left the penthouse in jeans and a sweater. Why are you wearing this? Amani flinched at the tone, looking down at the garment. It was stained with mud and rain now, but an hour ago, it had been pristine. The memory of Director Han's cold hands and sneering voice came rushing back. Han, she said quietly, her voice trembling. When his men took me, he made me change. He burned my clothes. He said. She swallowed hard, unable to look Teo in the eye. He said if I was going to be sold at his auction, I couldn't look like a maid. He wanted me to look like a trophy. A pretty doll for the buyers. The air around them seemed to drop 10 degrees. Teo went completely still. The veins in his neck bulged, and his jaw clenched so hard Amani thought he might crack a tooth. The idea that another man had stripped her, treated her like livestock, and dressed her up for his own amusement triggered a darkness in Teo that the bullet graze on his shoulder hadn't even touched. He wanted a doll, Teo repeated, the words sounding like grinding stones. The rain was soaking through his ruined white shirt, the fabric torn and stained with blood from the fight in the auction house. He didn't seem to feel the cold, but he felt Amani shivering against him. He looked at the green dress, the symbol of her captivity, and his jaw tightened. You are not a trophy, he said, lifting her off her feet as easily as if she were made of paper. He settled her high against his chest, her skin pressing against the damp heat of his chest through his shredded shirt. And you are definitely not a doll. You are the woman who brought a monster to his knees. He turned and began walking toward the black SUV that had just pulled up to the alley entrance, his stride long and purposeful. The driver scrambled out, holding the back door open and offering a heavy black wool coat. Teo didn't put it on himself. He snatched the coat and wrapped it around Amani, engulfing her small frame completely. He buttoned it up to her chin, hiding the green dress from view, burying the memory of Director Han under the heavy wool. "Burn it," he commanded the driver as he slid into the car with her. "When we get home, we burn that dress. And then I am going to remind you exactly who you belong to." The drive back to the penthouse was silent, save for the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the wet asphalt and the muffled drumming of rain against the bulletproof glass. Inside the climate-controlled cabin of the SUV, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and drying blood. Teo sat like a statue in the corner of the leather bench seat. Without the heavy trench coat he had wrapped around Amani, he was exposed. His white dress shirt, or what was left of it, was shredded at the shoulder and soaked through with rain and blood, clinging to his skin like translucent paper. He stared out the window at the blurring city lights, his jaw set in a hard line, his right arm hanging limp at his side. Amani sat next to him, drowning in the massive wool coat he had given her. It smelled like cedar and gunpowder. She watched him shiver, a microscopic tremor that rippled through his massive frame. It wasn't fear, it was the cold dampness of the shirt against his wounds. She reached out from the warmth of the coat, her hand trembling slightly, and placed it over his clenched fist resting on his knee. His skin was burning hot against the cold air of the cabin. "You're freezing," she whispered. "I am fine," he rumbled, not looking away from the window. "It is a scratch. You have a bullet graze on your deltoid that is soaking through that ruined shirt," she countered, her voice gaining a surprising amount of steel. "And you are shaking. Don't lie to me, Teo." He finally turned to look at him. The use of his first name seemed to snap him out of his trance. He looked at her small hand covering his massive, bruised knuckles. He turned his hand over, engulfing hers completely. "I am used to the cold," he said, his voice rough. "Keep the coat closed. You are shivering too." When the elevator doors slid open directly into the penthouse foyer, Teo tried to head straight for his study, likely to pour a drink and bury the pain. But Amani stepped in front of him, the oversized coat trailing on the floor like a royal robe. "Bathroom," she ordered. "Sit. That shirt needs to come off. Now." Teo stared at her. For a second, the security team by the elevator held their breath. But the golem just exhaled, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "As you wish, my queen," he murmured. The master bathroom was a cavern of black marble. Teo sat on the edge of the massive tub. He reached up to undo the buttons of his shirt, but his fingers fumbled. The fabric was stuck to the drying blood on his shoulder. "Let me," Amani whispered. She moved between his spread knees, gently peeling the soaked, shredded white cotton away from his skin. When the shirt finally fell to the floor in a wet, heavy heap, Amani had to bite her lip. His back was a map of violence, old scars, silver slash marks, and the fresh, angry red furrow where the bullet had grazed him. "Sorry," she whispered as she dipped a cloth into warm water. "This is going to sting." "It's not the pain," he grunted, his eyes squeezing shut as she cleaned the wound. "I am used to pain. I am not used to gentleness. No one touches the golem unless they want to die." He reached up with his good arm, his rough hand tracing the line of her jaw. "You are so small. I could break you without trying. And yet, you are the only one who isn't afraid." Amani placed her hand over his on her cheek. "I'm not afraid of the size of the wall, Teo. I'm just glad I finally found the door to get inside." The bedroom was vast, a cavern of gray silk and tempered glass that overlooked the sleeping city. Usually, Teo hated this room. It felt too large, too empty. But tonight, watching Amani move through the shadows to close the heavy blackout curtains, the room felt different. Teo sat on the edge of the California King mattress. He was shirtless, his shoulder bandaged, the white gauze stark against his tan skin. He watched her. "You should sleep," Amani said, turning back to face him. She had finally discarded the heavy coat and the ruined green dress, changing into one of his simple oversized t-shirts. She looked tiny in the middle of the floor, barefoot and defenseless. "The doctor said the painkillers would make you drowsy." "I don't take them," Teo muttered. "I need to hear if the perimeter alarms trip." "The alarms are silent, Teo. You can sleep." She walked toward the bed, not with the hesitation of a servant, but with the weary determination of a partner. Teo caught her wrist as she passed. He didn't pull, just held her there. "Why didn't you run?" The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Amani looked down at his hand, then up to his eyes. "We already talked about this. I couldn't let them kill you." "No," Teo corrected. "I mean before. When you first saw me. When you realized what I was. My own fiancée, the woman my father paid millions to marry me, she vomited the first time she saw me without a shirt. She called me a genetic mistake. So why are you the only one who doesn't look at me like I'm going to eat you? Amani moved then. She stepped closer, reaching out to place both hands on his face, forcing him to look at her. Because I know what it's like to be judged for what people see, not who you are, she said fiercely. She ran her thumb over the jagged scar on his cheekbone. I didn't run because I wasn't watching the golem. I was watching you. I watched you feed the stray cats behind the warehouse when you thought no one was looking. You aren't a monster, Teo. You're just lonely. The word cracked something open inside him. Teo let out a shuddering breath, leaning his forehead against her stomach, wrapping his massive arms around her waist. He buried his face in the soft cotton of her shirt, surrendering completely. Lonely, he repeated, the word tasting foreign. Terrified, she corrected softly. You're terrified that if you let someone in, they'll leave when they see the cracks. Teo tightened his hold, his voice muffled against her stomach. I won't let you go, he mumbled, fierce and possessive. You realize that, don't you? Now that I have you. I am never letting you go. If you try to run now, I will burn the city down to find you. Amani laughed softly, running her fingers through his dark hair. Good, she whispered. Because I'm not going anywhere. Over the next 2 weeks, the penthouse underwent a transformation that was both subtle and terrifying to the staff who worked there. For years, the residence had been operated like a military black site, silent, sterile, and governed by fear. Now, it was domestic. But domestic life with a 6'7" sociopath was a unique kind of chaos. It started in the kitchen. Teo, in a misguided attempt to care for Amani while she recovered from the shock of the sniper attack, decided he would make breakfast. The result was a crime scene. Amani walked in at 7 a.m. to find the golem standing amidst a wreckage of eggshells and spilled flour, holding a delicate porcelain coffee mug that looked like a thimble in his hand. I broke the handle, he admitted, his voice grave, as if reporting a casualty of war. Amani leaned against the doorframe, fighting a smile. She was wearing one of his silk dress shirts, the hem hitting her mid-thigh, the sleeves rolled up 4 times just to free her hands. Teo, she said, crossing the room to take the ruined mug from him. You are the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar syndicate. You can dismantle a handgun in 3 seconds blindfolded. Why can you not operate a toaster? The buttons are too small, he grumbled, lifting her onto the marble island counter so he could be eye level with her. He stepped between her knees, resting his hands on the counter on either side of her hips, boxing her in. And I don't like the machine. It pops up too aggressively. Amani laughed, a sound that stopped the entire kitchen staff in their tracks. The chefs, usually terrified to even make eye contact with the master, watched in disbelief as the former housekeeper poked the golem in his chest. Out, she commanded, pointing to the living room. I will make the coffee. You go sit down and look intimidating somewhere else. He didn't move. Instead, he leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead, lingering there. I prefer to look at you, he murmured. The dynamic of the house had shifted tectonically. Amani was no longer the help, but she wasn't just a guest either. She was the anchor. The security team, usually stoic statues, had started looking to her for cues on Teo's mood. If Amani was smiling, the boss was calm. If Amani was frowning, everyone checked their ammo. But the real shift happened at night. Teo had insisted on sleeping on the very edge of the bed, facing the door, his body rigid and alert. He treated sleep like a security risk. For the first 3 nights, he lay there like a stone gargoyle, terrified that if he moved, his sheer mass would crush her. Come here, Amani whispered into the dark on the 4th night. I am fine here, he lied, his back to her. Teo, come here. It wasn't a request. It was a command. He rolled over, the mattress groaning under the shift in weight. Amani didn't wait, she scooted backward until her back was pressed against his chest. She grabbed his heavy arm, an arm thicker than her thigh, and pulled it over her waist, locking him in place. You are too heavy, he whispered, panic edging into his voice as he tried to hold his weight off her. I will suffocate you. You're warm, she countered sleepily, intertwining her fingers with his massive ones. And I sleep better when I know the monster is holding the door shut. He froze. Slowly, inch by inch, he let his muscles relax. He curled his massive frame around her, his chin resting on the top of her head, his knees tucked behind hers. He became a human shield, a cocoon of muscle and heat. For the first time in a decade, the golem didn't dream of fire or blood. He fell asleep listening to the rhythm of her breathing, his hand resting possessively over her heart, guarding the only thing in the world that made him feel human. They were in a bubble, a fragile, perfect world where size didn't matter and fear didn't exist. But outside the penthouse glass, the city was watching. and the invitation that arrived on a silver tray the next morning was about to pop the bubble. The Winter Gala, Teo read, his lip curling in disgust as he tossed the heavy cardstock onto the table. Burn it. Wait, Amani said, picking it up. Why? Because it is a parade of vultures in expensive suits, he spat. And I do not want them looking at you. They're already looking, Teo, she said quietly, reading the calligraphy. The rumors are already spreading. If we hide, they'll think you're weak. They'll think I made you weak. She looked up at him, her eyes flashing with a challenge. Let's go. Let's show them exactly who holds the leash. The grand ballroom of the Conrad Hotel was a Shark Tank disguised as a gala. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the ceiling, casting a fractured, glittering light over the assembled elite of Seoul. It was a sea of black tuxedos and designer silk, the air perfumed with expensive champagne and quiet, deadly gossip. When the double doors opened for them, the room didn't just go quiet, the silence rippled outward like a shockwave. Kwan Teo stood in the archway, a titan in a bespoke black velvet tuxedo that seemed to swallow the light around him. He didn't look like a guest, he looked like an invasion. His scar was on full display, a jagged line of history that he usually hid in the shadows. But tonight, he wore it like a warning. Beside him, Amani was a vision of defiance. She wore a gown of liquid silver that clung to her curves like a second skin, a stark contrast to the dark mass of the man beside her. Her head was high, her hand resting lightly, possessively, on the crook of his arm. They are staring, Teo murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her fingertips. I should gouge their eyes out. Let them stare, Amani whispered back, squeezing his bicep. They've never seen a king and queen before. Just keep walking, giant. Don't growl at the waiters. They moved through the crowd, the sea of bodies parting instinctively to let the golem pass. Amani could hear the whispers trailing in their wake like smoke. Is that the maid? I heard she was a hostage. Look at the size of him. How does she not break? Teo was tense, his muscles coiled tight. Every time a man looked at Amani for a second too long, Teo's glare sharpened into something lethal. He was scanning the room for threats, for snipers, for knives. He wasn't seeing the party, he was seeing a kill box. Teo, Amani said softly, pulling his attention back to her. She reached up and adjusted his bow tie, a domestic intimacy performed in front of 1,000 sharks. Look at me. You're doing fine. Just breathe. He looked down at her, the feral glint in his eyes softening. I hate this, he admitted. I want to take you home. I want to lock the doors and keep you where it is safe. Mr. Kwan, a slick voice interrupted them. Teo stiffened, turning to face a group of elderly board members who looked terrified but determined to greet him. As he was pulled into a conversation about mergers and territory lines, Amani stepped back slightly to give him space. It was a mistake. The moment she was separated from his immediate gravity, the Shark Tank shifted. You must be the famous housekeeper. The voice was melodious, polished, and cold as liquid nitrogen. Amani turned to find a woman standing behind her, holding a flute of champagne like a weapon. She was stunning, pale skin, razor-sharp cheekbones, and dressed in pristine white. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been brought to life and taught to hate. Park Soo-min. The ex-fiancée. Amani recognized her from the tabloids, but the pictures hadn't captured the sheer, overwhelming icy aura the woman projected. Soo-min looked Amani up and down, her gaze lingering on the silver dress with a mixture of amusement and disgust. Soo-min, Amani said, keeping her voice even. I wondered if you'd be here. Of course I'm here, Soo-min smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. This is my world. You're just visiting. She stepped closer, invading Amani's personal space with a cloud of expensive perfume. I have to admit, I was curious. I wanted to see the little mouse that Teo picked up from the gutter. I'm not a mouse, Amani said calmly, refusing to step back. Aren't you? Soo-min took a sip of her drink, her eyes darting over Amani's shoulder to where Teo was towering over the board members. You think you love him, don't you? You think you've tamed the beast. She laughed softly, a cruel, tinkling sound. Honey, you haven't tamed anything. You're just a novelty. He's a monster. A violent, broken thing. He broke me, you know. With his silence. With his darkness. He'll break you too. He's too big, too heavy, too much for a little thing like you. She leaned in, her lips brushing Amani's ear. He doesn't want a wife. He wants a pet. And when he gets bored of playing house, he'll crush you. Amani felt a flash of heat rise up her neck, but it wasn't fear. It was anger. Pure, molten defensive rage, not for herself, but for Teo. She looked at the woman who had left him, the woman who had confirmed his worst fears about himself, and she smiled. Is that what happened? Amani asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Or did you just realize that you weren't a woman enough to handle him? Sumin's porcelain mask cracked. Her eyes widened, her mouth opening in shock. But before she could respond, Amani set her empty glass on a passing tray. Excuse me, Amani said politely. I need to powder my nose. Try not to melt while I'm gone. She turned and walked toward the ladies' room, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew the game wasn't over. Sumin was following her. The real fight was about to begin away from the cameras, where the claws would truly come out. The ladies' room was a palace of rose gold and white marble, silent enough to hear a pin drop. Amani gripped the edge of the sink, staring at her reflection. She looked composed, the silver dress fit her like armor, and her hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, but inside, her hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of swimming in a shark tank. The heavy door creaked open behind her. Amani didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Sumin walked in, her heels clicking rhythmically against the tile like a ticking clock. She didn't look at Amani immediately. Instead, she moved to the row of stalls, pushing each door open to ensure they were empty. Once she was satisfied they were alone, she turned back to the entrance and slid the brass lock into place with a sharp click. Cute dress, Sumin said, moving to the sink beside Amani. She pulled a tube of lipstick from her clutch, leaning in to examine her flawless skin. Did he buy it for you? Or did you have to earn it? I know how Teo likes to barter. Amani turned on the faucet, letting the water run over her wrists to cool her pulse. He bought it, she said calmly, watching the woman in the mirror. Because he likes to see me shine. It must bother you, knowing he never looked at you that way. Sumin laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. She capped her lipstick and slammed it down on the marble. Look at me? My dear, he worshipped me. Our families combined control half of Seoul. We were a dynasty waiting to happen. But he... She shuddered, a genuine flicker of revulsion crossing her face. He is defective. You know that, don't you? He doesn't feel things like normal people. He's violent. Cold. And when he touches you, don't you feel like you're being crushed by a mountain? She turned to face Amani, her eyes narrowing. I left him because I refused to be a monster's bride. I have standards. But you. I suppose when you spend your life scrubbing floors, anything looks like a step up. Even a beast. Amani slowly dried her hands on a linen towel. The shaking had stopped. In fact, she felt a strange sense of pity welling up. This woman, with her diamonds and her pedigree, was terrified. She was trying to break Amani because Amani had succeeded where she had failed. Amani stepped closer, invading the socialite's personal space. Sumin stiffened, instinctively taking a half step back. You're right, Amani said softly. He is big. And he is dangerous. But you are wrong about why he is cold. Excuse me? Sumin scoffed. He was cold because he was freezing, Amani said, her voice gaining strength. He was waiting for someone to offer him warmth, and all you offered him was fear. You looked at his scars and saw ugly things. You looked at his size and saw a threat. Amani stepped forward again, and Sumin hit the edge of the counter, trapped. You asked if I feel crushed? Amani whispered, leaning in. When he touches me, his hands shake because he is so afraid of hurting me. He sleeps on the edge of the bed to keep me safe. He took a bullet for me. What did he ever do for you, Sumin? Besides buy you jewelry to apologize for existing? Sumin's face flushed a deep, ugly red. She raised her hand, her nails sharp and manicured, aiming for Amani's face. You insolent little. Amani caught her wrist in midair. She didn't squeeze hard, just enough to hold it there. The training from watching Teo, the way he moved, the way he anticipated violence, kicked in. Don't, Amani warned, her eyes flashing. I spend my days cleaning up after a man who could snap you in half. Do you really think I'm afraid of a pampered princess? She released Sumin's wrist with a dismissive flick. Sumin stumbled back, clutching her hand, looking at Amani with wide, stunned eyes. Amani turned back to the mirror. She reapplied her lip gloss, pressed her lips together, and smoothed the front of her silver gown. You left him because you were scared of his shadow, Amani said to the reflection of the woman behind her. I walked into the dark and turned on the light. That is why he is mine. And that is why you are just a ghost haunting a party you no longer belong to. She unlocked the door and walked out without looking back, leaving the ex-fiancé standing alone in the cold, white silence. Amani had a king to get back to. Amani stepped back into the ballroom, and the noise hit her like a physical wall. The gentle hum of the string quartet was being drowned out by the rising murmur of the crowd and the staccato pop-pop-pop of camera flashes near the entrance. The press had been allowed in for the final toasts, and the sharks were smelling blood in the water. She scanned the room, ignoring the heavy gazes of the socialites who parted to let her pass. She found him instantly. It wasn't hard, he was a head taller than every other man in the room. Teo was standing near the center pillar, surrounded by a tight ring of nervous businessmen. He looked like a trapped tiger. His eyes were darting around the room, scanning faces, his hand flexing rhythmically at his side. He was looking for her. The moment their eyes met across the sea of tuxedos, Amani saw his shoulders drop an inch. The tension leaking out of him was palpable even from 30 feet away. But before she could reach him, a flash of white cut through the crowd. Sumin had emerged from the hallway, her face recomposed into a mask of tragic elegance. She saw the cameras. She saw the opportunity. She made a beeline for Teo, timing her approach perfectly as a cluster of photographers turned their lenses toward the golem. "Teo," she called out, her voice pitched perfectly to carry over the chatter. Teo stiffened. He turned, his face hardening into a mask of stone as he recognized his ex-fiancée. But Sumin didn't stop at a polite distance. She stepped right into his personal zone, the forbidden radius that even his security team hesitated to enter. "It has been so long," she sighed, reaching out to place a manicured hand on his forearm. "I heard about the attack. I was so worried about you." The contact was electric, in the worst way possible. Teo recoiled as if he had been burned. He physically stepped back, his arm jerking away from her touch with a violence that made the nearby guests gasp. The room went dead silent. The string quartet faltered and stopped. 1,000 eyes fixed on the trio, the monster, the ex, and the maid standing just outside the circle. "Do not touch me," Teo growled. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to the back of the room like a crack of thunder. "I told you that 2 years ago. I am telling you now." Sumin's hand hovered in the air, rejected. Her face crumbled, tears welling up on command for the cameras. I still care about you, Teo. We have history. Surely you aren't going to let her," she gestured vaguely toward Amani with a sneer, "ruin everything our family's built. Look at her. She doesn't belong here." Teo followed her gaze. He looked at Amani. For a terrifying second, no one moved. Then, Teo turned his back on Sumin completely. He didn't even dignify her with an insult. He simply erased her from his existence. He walked toward Amani, his long strides eating up the distance. The crowd parted frantically, terrified of being in his path. When he reached her, he didn't grab her or pull her away. He did something that made the entire ballroom gasp in collective shock. The great golem of soul, the man who broke bones for a living, dropped to one knee. He knelt on the polished parquet floor at Amani's feet. A hushed whisper raced through the room. Was he proposing? Was he begging? Teo reached out with his massive, scarred hands and gently adjusted the hem of her silver gown, which had caught slightly on her heel. He smoothed the fabric with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Then, keeping one knee on the ground, he looked up at her, ignoring the hundreds of people watching. "Are you ready to leave?" he asked softly, his voice for her ears only. "I can't breathe in here without you." Amani rested her hand on his shoulder, feeling the solid heat of him. "I'm ready, giant. Take me home." Teo stood up, rising to his full, terrifying height. He wrapped a heavy arm around Amani's waist, pulling her flush against his side. He turned to face the room, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on the reporters near the front. He looked at Sumin, then at the cameras. "Write this down," he commanded, his voice cold and absolute. The reporters scrambled, pens poising, recorders thrust forward. "This woman," Teo said, tightening his grip on Amani, "is the lady of my house. She is the only reason I haven't burned this city to the ground. If you disrespect her, if you look at her wrong, if you print one word against her." He let the threat hang in the air, heavy and promising violence. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in Seoul knew what the golem was capable of. "We are leaving," he announced. "Do not follow us." He turned and guided Amani toward the exit, shielding her body with his own. As they walked out into the cool night air, leaving the stunned silence of the gala behind them, Amani looked up at him. He wasn't looking back at the life he was leaving behind. He was looking down at her, and for the first time in his life, the golem was smiling. 6 months later, the sun did something it had never done before in the penthouse of the Millennium Tower. It actually reached the floor. For years, the heavy blackout curtains had been drawn tight, turning the apartment into a permanent cave. Now, they were pulled back, letting the warm, golden afternoon light spill across the room. And where there used to be empty gray space and cold marble, there was life. A massive fiddle-leaf fig tree stood in the corner, reaching for the ceiling. Potted ferns lined the windowsills. There were throw pillows on the couch, soft, colorful things that looked ridiculous against the stark industrial architecture, but Teo guarded them as if they were made of gold because Amani had picked them out. Teo sat on the floor in the middle of the living room. It was an absurd image, the most feared crime lord in South Korea, a man who could silence a boardroom with a single glance, sitting cross-legged on a rug like a child. He was surrounded by piles of paperwork, but he wasn't looking at the contracts. He was watching Amani. She was on the phone in the kitchen, laughing at something her sister was saying on the other end. She was wearing one of his oversized hoodies and a pair of leggings, her hair tied up in a messy bun. She looked comfortable. She looked home. Teo shifted, the movement rippling through his massive frame. The scar on his face had faded slightly, or maybe it just didn't look as angry in the sunlight. He no longer wore the Kevlar vest under his shirt inside the house. The gun he used to keep taped under the coffee table was gone, locked away in a safe that only Amani had the code to. "You're staring again," Amani said, hanging up the phone and walking over to him. She didn't walk around the piles of paper, she stepped right over them, invading his workspace with the confidence of someone who owned the place. "I am supervising," Teo rumbled, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He reached out and caught her hand, pulling her down. Amani went willingly, settling between his legs, her back resting against his broad chest. He immediately wrapped his arms around her, locking her in. It was his favorite place in the world, the fortress of his own body, shielding her from everything else. "Are you happy, Teo?" she asked quietly, leaning her head back against his shoulder. The question caught him off guard. He rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her vanilla shampoo. He thought about the last 30 years of his life, the violence, the noise, the constant, grinding loneliness of being a monster in a world of glass houses. "I didn't know what the word meant," he admitted, his voice a low vibration against her back. "I thought happiness was just the absence of pain. I thought it was silence." He tightened his arms around her, burying his face in her neck. "But it isn't silence. It is this. It is the sound of you laughing in the kitchen. It is the smell of those ridiculous candles you bought.